Every second, roughly 2 people die somewhere on Earth. Their hearts stop, their brain signals go quiet, and in that moment, science hits a wall it has never climbed over. We can map every organ, we can sequence the genome, we can track a single electron across the lab, but the moment a conscious mind goes dark, we have no equation for what happens next. None. And the deeper researchers look, the stranger it gets. Brains that show zero activity producing vivid, structured experiences, bystanders sharing visions with the dying, quantum fields that may carry something we do not have a name for yet. If you find this as astonishing as we do, subscribe. You will want to see where this goes. Settle in. We begin. There is no single moment you die. That sentence alone should stop you cold. We grow up believing death is an event, a line. One side living, the other side not. It feels that way in movies, in hospitals, in the quiet moment a family gets the news. But when you press biology on exactly where that line sits, it moves. Every time. Here is what actually happens in a hospital room. A patient's heart stops, the monitor flatlines, a doctor checks for a pulse, checks for breath, looks at a clock, and calls the time of death. That moment gets written on a certificate. It becomes official, legal, permanent, and the biology inside that body ignores it completely. Skin cells keep living for several hours after the heart stops. Muscle tissue can respond to stimulation for hours beyond that. Bone marrow stays viable for days. Individual neurons, the cells that carry your thoughts, your memories, your sense of self, begin dying at different rates, depending on where they sit in the brain. Some go in minutes, others linger far longer. The body does not shut off like a light switch. It powers down room by room, cell by cell, across a span of time that medicine is only beginning to map. So when exactly did you die? This is a serious scientific question, and the answer depends entirely on which part of you we are measuring. If we measure circulation, death happened the moment the heart stopped. If we measure electrical activity in the brain, death happened a few minutes later, when the last signal faded. If we measure cellular life, death is still happening long after the funeral. Doctors define death in 2 ways, and they use both depending on context. The first is cardiac death, when the heart stops and cannot restart. The second is brain death, when all brain function is irreversibly gone. These 2 things can happen hours apart. A person can be legally dead by one definition, while still biologically active by the other. This matters for more than philosophy. Organ transplant medicine depends entirely on knowing when death is final enough that removing a heart or kidney is ethically permitted. Resuscitation science has brought people back after periods that would have been called permanent death just 30 years ago. The boundary keeps shifting as our technology improves, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the line keeps moving as we get better at looking, was there ever a fixed line at all? The ancient Greeks believed the soul left with the last breath. Medieval medicine added the heartbeat as the marker. Modern neuroscience moved the finish line again, to the brain. Each era drew the boundary at the edge of what it could measure. We may be doing the same thing right now. And here is where it gets genuinely strange. Recent research into the dying process has found that the body appears to have biological systems designed specifically for shutdown. Hormones release. Certain neurotransmitters flood the brain in specific sequences. The process follows a pattern, almost like the body knows what it is doing, almost like dying is something evolution prepared us for, not just an absence of living. Why would evolution build a dying process? What purpose does an organized shutdown serve? That question does not have a clean answer yet, but the fact that the question exists at all tells you something important. Death is not simply the absence of life. It is a distinct biological state, with its own mechanics, its own chemistry, its own timeline. And that timeline, it turns out, includes something that researchers were completely unprepared to find happening inside the brain. A body pronounced dead at noon is still, in a very real sense, partly alive at midnight. That sounds like horror fiction. It is confirmed biology. In the hours after cardiac death, the body does not become inert. It becomes a landscape of delayed shutdown, where different systems fail on entirely different schedules. And studying that landscape has forced scientists to rethink what the word dead actually describes. Here is the detail that changes how you see it. Researchers studying gene activity in recently deceased humans found something that stunned them. Hundreds of genes, including genes involved in stress response, immune function, and even fetal development, became more active after death. They did not wind down. They switched on. Some genes that are almost entirely silent during normal, healthy life fired up in the hours following cardiac arrest, as if the body were attempting something. A repair? A response? Scientists confirmed the pattern but have struggled to explain the purpose. Skin cells can be harvested and grown in a laboratory for several days after a person dies. They divide. They function. By any cellular measure, they are alive. Eye banks routinely collect corneas up to 12 hours after death because the tissue remains viable. Bone can be donated up to 72 hours after the heart stops. The part that matters most for understanding consciousness is what happens to the brain during this window. Neurons are extraordinarily hungry cells. The brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy, despite being only about 2% of its weight. The moment blood stops flowing, neurons begin running out of fuel fast. Within 4 to 6 minutes of cardiac arrest, significant irreversible damage begins in the most vulnerable regions. The hippocampus, which handles memory, is among the first to suffer. But here is the complication. Damage beginning is different from function ending. For a measurable window, neurons are damaged and still active simultaneously. They are in a state biology calls the penumbra, a gray zone between full function and complete failure. And what happens inside that penumbra during a cardiac event? What the brain actually produces in those minutes turned out to be one of the most debated findings in all of neuroscience. The penumbra is not silence. It is the opposite. The cells under stress begin releasing stored chemicals in large quantities. Ion channels that normally regulate carefully controlled electrical signals lose their grip. Charges cascade through tissue. What should be an orderly shutdown produces something that looks, on a scan, like a storm. Think of it like a city losing power. Before the lights go out completely, the grid surges. Circuits overload. Breakers trip in sequence. For a few seconds, more electricity moves through the system than during normal operation. Then darkness. That surge inside the dying brain carries information. It carries activity. Scientists confirmed it is measurable, structured, and in some documented cases, extraordinary in its intensity. Here is what that raised. If the brain produces its most intense activity precisely as it is shutting down, what is that activity generating in the person experiencing it? The answer to that question pushed researchers towards something they spent decades trying to avoid studying scientifically. And the data they found was far harder to dismiss than anyone expected. In 2013, a team of scientists at the University of Michigan did something that changed the conversation permanently. They monitored the brain activity of rats during induced cardiac arrest. What they recorded in the 30 seconds after the heart stopped should have been a gradual fade. Signals slowing, quieting, falling toward flat. Instead, they watched the brain erupt. Gamma waves, the fastest, most coordinated type of brain activity, and the kind most strongly associated with conscious perception in humans, surged to levels higher than anything recorded during normal waking life. The dying brain did not wind down. It briefly became hyperactive in the most cognitively significant way possible. The researchers confirmed the finding, published it, and then spent years trying to understand what it meant. Gamma waves are associated with the moments when your brain pulls information together, when separate sensory signals, sight, sound, emotion, memory, bind into a single unified experience. Neuroscientists believe gamma synchrony is part of what creates the felt sense of being present, of having a continuous, coherent experience of reality. At the edge of death, that process fired harder than it ever does in life. Now, the researchers were careful. They studied rats, not humans. You cannot ask a rat what it experienced. The gamma surge is a measurable electrical event, and interpreting what that means for subjective experience requires a much larger leap. The scientists said so directly. They were measuring brain activity, and inferring experience from that is a separate and genuinely difficult problem. But the timing is striking. The surge happens in the window, that people who survive cardiac arrest most commonly describe as the period of their near-death experience. The peak of the electrical storm and the peak of reported visions overlap. A follow-up study published in 2023 extended this finding to humans. Researchers monitored 4 patients who died of cardiac arrest while already connected to brain monitoring equipment for unrelated reasons. In 2 of the 4 patients, they recorded a surge of gamma activity after the heart stopped. In 1 patient, the surge came from regions of the brain involved in dreaming, visual processing, and memory retrieval, all firing together, coordinated, for a brief window after clinical death. The researchers were explicit. They could not claim this caused any particular experience. They could confirm the electrical event was real, measurable, and happened in humans after the heart stopped, in the regions most associated with conscious perception. Here is why that matters physically. The brain uses electrical synchrony across different regions to create experience. If those regions fire together in the right pattern, the brain is, by its own operating logic, doing what it does when you're consciously aware. The fact that the body is dying at the same moment does not, by itself, erase that. What it raises is a question that cuts to the foundation of neuroscience. If consciousness is produced by brain activity, and brain activity surges at death, then something is being produced, something that may be, by the brain's own standards, more vivid than ordinary waking life. What that something looks like from the inside has been reported by millions of people across every culture on Earth, and those reports share details that have no business being so consistent. Across thousands of years, across every continent, across cultures with no contact with each other, people who come close to death and return describe the same things. That consistency is the problem, and the opportunity. A researcher named Raymond Moody collected and analyzed hundreds of accounts from people who were resuscitated after cardiac arrest in the 1970s. He identified a cluster of recurring elements, a sense of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel or passageway, encountering a brilliant light that felt warm and non-threatening, meeting figures described as deceased relatives or beings of light, experiencing a vivid review of their life, and then returning with a distinct reluctance, often reporting that they were told or simply understood it was not their time. Moody coined the term near-death experience. What he did not expect was the scale of what came after. Subsequent researchers found the same pattern independently in countries across Europe, Asia, South America, and Africa. People who had never read Moody's work, people from cultures with entirely different religious frameworks around death, reported the same core features. A large-scale study conducted across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom and the United States enrolled over 2,000 cardiac arrest patients and found that roughly 10% of those successfully resuscitated reported a near-death experience. Among those who could be interviewed in detail, the recurring features held. Here is the detail that shakes easy explanations. The pattern appears in people blind from birth. They report visual elements, including light, figures, and scenes, despite having no neurological template for visual experience. The pattern appears in young children who have not been exposed to cultural narratives about death. It appears in people who had no belief in an afterlife and found the experience deeply unwanted and disorienting. The easy dismissal is that near-death experiences are hallucinations produced by a stressed brain. That is a legitimate scientific hypothesis. Hallucinations are real, and a brain starved of oxygen is a brain under extreme stress. The problem with stopping there is that hallucinations are typically fragmented, internally inconsistent, and difficult to remember clearly afterward. Near-death experiences are the opposite. Survivors describe them as more real than ordinary waking life. They remember them in sharp detail decades later. They are frequently life-altering in their psychological impact, in ways that random hallucinations are not. A second easy dismissal is cultural contamination. The idea that people have absorbed these narratives from religion or media and are unconsciously recreating them. That explanation struggles with the blind individuals, the young children, and the cross-cultural populations who had no access to Western near-death narrative templates. A third dismissal is that survivors are simply reporting what they expected death to feel like. But many survivors report deep surprise. Some describe the experience as entirely outside any prior framework they held. None of this proves anything about an afterlife. That distinction matters. What the evidence does confirm is that there is a reproducible, globally consistent psychological event associated with the dying process, and its cause remains an open scientific question. And within that event, one feature stands apart from all the others for sheer biological impossibility. Imagine every moment of your life playing back at once. Your first memory, every face you have ever loved, every embarrassing mistake, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon that you had completely forgotten. All of it present simultaneously, with emotional weight attached to each moment, vivid and immediate, as if it is happening right now. Survivors of near-death experiences call this the life review, and the scale of it has no parallel in ordinary human cognition. People who have experienced it describe reviewing decades of memory in what they felt was a span of seconds. They describe observing their own life from outside themselves, sometimes seeing events from other people's perspectives, feeling the emotional impact of their actions on others, as if those emotions belonged to them in that moment. They describe it as comprehensive, total, a complete record of a self, present all at once. Neuroscience has no mechanism for this. Memory retrieval in the healthy brain is slow, effortful, and incomplete. You cannot voluntarily replay more than a few seconds of specific memory at one time. Emotional recall degrades details. Long-term memories are reconstructed each time you access them, not played back from a perfect recording. The brain has no known process for simultaneously activating decades of memory with emotional clarity in a span of seconds. And yet the reports are remarkably consistent across cultures and individuals. The content differs, but the structure, total, simultaneous, emotionally comprehensive, is the same. One theory, still speculative, draws on what physics says about time and information. Ordinary memory works through sequences, one moment, then the next, because the brain processes information in time. Under extreme conditions, some neuroscientists have proposed that the regulatory systems that enforce sequential processing may collapse, allowing associative memory networks to activate in a massive cascade rather than a controlled stream. Everything linked to everything else, firing at once. That would feel from the inside like experiencing all of it simultaneously, like every thread of your life unspooled into a single knot of presence. Here is the deeper problem. The life review raises a question about information. Your memories are stored across vast networks of neurons, distributed throughout the brain. Accessing a single memory requires activating that network. Accessing all of them simultaneously would require something coordinating the entire system at once, something with access to the whole. What is doing the coordinating? In healthy life, attention manages memory retrieval. You direct awareness toward a specific memory and the relevant network activates. The life review appears to happen without that direction, without any voluntary act. It simply plays, which implies something is running it that operates below or above the level of ordinary directed thought. Some researchers have quietly suggested that what the life review reveals is that memory may be stored more completely than we thought, and that the dying process accesses a layer of storage that ordinary cognition never touches. There is a confirmed phenomenon that makes that idea far harder to ignore. Patients with severely damaged brains that should have lost those memories entirely, sometimes experience something similar. And when they speak about it, they do something that should be physically impossible. In 2009, a researcher named Michael Nahm began formally documenting a phenomenon that doctors had been quietly noting for centuries and never knew what to do with. He called it terminal lucidity. The pattern goes like this. A patient with severe long-term neurological damage, suddenly, in the hours or days before death, becomes completely clear, coherent, recognizes family members they had not recognized in years, speaks in complete sentences, recalls memories, has full conversations, then dies. This happens in patients with Alzheimer's disease, where brain tissue has physically deteriorated over years. It happens in patients who suffered strokes that destroyed entire regions responsible for language and memory. It happens in patients with brain tumors pressing on the structures that generate conscious experience. The brain, by every clinical measure, should be incapable of producing the behavior observed. Nahm gathered cases from medical literature spanning more than 250 years. He found the pattern across countries, across disease types, across historical periods before any shared medical tradition could explain the consistency. He confirmed it was real, reproducible, and completely unexplained. Here is the specific detail that matters. In Alzheimer's disease, the brain physically loses tissue. Neurons die and are not replaced. The protein plaques and tangles that define the disease are visible on autopsy. The structural hardware that stores specific memories is gone. And yet, patients in terminal lucidity accurately recall specific people, specific events, specific details from their past that their damaged brains should have no capacity to access. Where is the information coming from? The standard neuroscientific model says memory is stored in synaptic connections between neurons. Destroy the neurons, destroy the memory. Terminal lucidity directly contradicts that model in documented clinical cases. The memory appears accurate and specific from a brain that has lost the tissue supposed to hold it. Several explanations have been proposed. One suggests that memories are stored more redundantly than we think, and that areas of the brain never recruited under normal conditions activate during the dying process. Another proposes that the dying brain undergoes a kind of electrical liberation, where suppressive systems shut down first and release activity that was always there, but blocked. Neither explanation fully accounts for the accuracy of recalled content in patients where the relevant tissue is demonstrably gone. A minority of researchers have raised a harder possibility. If memory is not stored solely in the physical structure of neurons, if it is encoded in something the neuron participates in, but does not solely contain, then the destruction of the neuron would not erase it. This remains a fringe idea in neuroscience. It is completely mainstream in certain branches of physics, where the relationship between information and physical substrate is deeply contested. The question of whether information can survive the destruction of its physical container is one of the most serious open problems in theoretical physics, and it connects directly to something happening at the smallest scale of biology that most people have never heard of. Because deep inside the cells of your brain, something is happening that quantum mechanics is only beginning to describe. And it may matter enormously for what we are talking about. For most of the 20th century, scientists assumed the brain was too warm, too wet, and too chaotic for quantum effects to matter. Quantum phenomena, the strange behaviors of particles at the smallest scale, were thought to require near absolute zero temperatures and total isolation from environmental noise. A biological brain operates at body temperature, surrounded by fluid, running billions of chemical reactions simultaneously. The assumption was that any delicate quantum behavior would be instantly washed out by that thermal chaos. That assumption turned out to be wrong. In 2007, a team studying photosynthesis in plants found quantum coherence operating in a warm, wet biological system with remarkable efficiency. The energy absorbed by a leaf was moving through molecular structures using a quantum process called superposition, essentially exploring multiple pathways simultaneously before settling on the most efficient route. This was confirmed in subsequent studies. Quantum effects were real, functional, and biologically useful. The discovery cracked open a field now called quantum biology. Researchers began finding quantum effects in bird navigation, in enzyme reactions, in the way your nose detects smell at the molecular level. The warm, wet chaos of biology was not destroying these effects. In some cases, it appeared to be using them. This had direct implications for the brain. Inside neurons are structures called microtubules. They are cylindrical protein scaffolds that help maintain the cell's shape and manage internal transport. Under an electron microscope, they look like hollow tubes built from repeating protein subunits. For decades, they were understood as purely mechanical structural elements. But their geometry is peculiar. The subunits that make up microtubules can exist in two slightly different physical configurations, and they switch between them. At the molecular level, this switching behavior has properties that look like quantum computation. Each subunit, at least theoretically, can be in a superposition of both states simultaneously, until some interaction forces it to choose. A single neuron contains thousands of microtubules. Each microtubule contains thousands of those subunits. The number of possible computational states across the microtubules of a single neuron exceeds any classical computing estimate for consciousness by an enormous margin. And they are all coupled together, vibrating in synchronized patterns, across the entire structure of the cell. This is where a physicist named Roger Penrose and an anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff entered the picture, and where the conversation about consciousness began to leave ordinary neuroscience behind entirely. Their proposal was specific and controversial. Consciousness, they argued, arises from quantum computations inside microtubules. The moment of conscious experience corresponds to a quantum event, specifically a collapse of superposition, occurring in coordinated fashion across massive numbers of these structures simultaneously. They named the proposed process orchestrated objective reduction. Most neuroscientists rejected it. Some physicists found it intriguing. The argument has not been resolved. But here is what the debate illuminated regardless of who is right. If quantum processes are genuinely involved in generating consciousness, then consciousness operates at a level of physics where the rules are fundamentally different, where information behaves in ways that have no parallel in classical mechanics, where the fate of that information, at death, may be governed by principles science has barely begun to write. And one of those principles has an implication so strange that most scientists prefer not to say it out loud. In quantum mechanics, there is a rule that has survived every experimental challenge thrown at it for nearly a century. Information cannot be destroyed. This is not a philosophical preference. It is a consequence of the fundamental equations that describe how physical systems evolve. The universe, at its deepest level, appears to run on reversible processes. Every state can, in principle, be traced back to the state before it. Nothing is lost. The record is never erased. Physicists call this the conservation of quantum information. It is so foundational that when Stephen Hawking proposed that black holes violated it, the debate that followed lasted 30 years and involved some of the most intense arguments in the history of modern physics. Hawking eventually conceded. Information, even in a black hole, is preserved. Now apply that to the brain. If consciousness involves quantum processes, and if those processes encode information in the quantum state of biological structures, then at death, when those structures break down, that information does not cease to exist. By the fundamental rules of physics, it transforms, it disperses, it enters the broader quantum state of the environment, but it does not disappear. This is where the language of physics and the language of human experience begin to brush against each other in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. Saying that quantum information is preserved is very different from saying that you, personally, survived death. A dispersed pattern of quantum information in the environment is not a mind having experiences. The continuity, the felt sense of self, the specific structure that makes you you, may be gone even if some underlying information technically persists. But the question the physics raises is still worth sitting with. If the information that constituted your consciousness was encoded at the quantum level, and if quantum information is conserved, then something that the universe computed in the process of being you has not been erased. It has been redistributed. Whether that redistribution preserves anything that matters to you as a person depends entirely on what consciousness actually is. And that is a question physics alone cannot answer. Here is the version that stays with you. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Each neuron makes thousands of connections. The information density of the human brain exceeds any human-made storage system by orders of magnitude. If even a fraction of that information is encoded at the quantum level, then at the moment of death, the universe receives a transfer of structured information of staggering complexity. Where does it go? Into what? For how long does it remain coherent before entropy finally wins? These are real scientific questions, open ones. And the answer may hinge on something that nobody understands yet, something that sits at the border between physics and philosophy, and has resisted every attempt to solve it for over a century. What exactly is the relationship between physical processes and the experience of being alive? Roger Penrose arrived at consciousness through a completely unexpected door: mathematics. He was studying the nature of mathematical insight, specifically the moment when a mathematician suddenly grasps a proof, and he became convinced that something was happening that classical computation could not account for. Classical computers operate by following rules. Every output is determined by the inputs and the algorithm. There is no room for anything beyond the mechanics. Penrose argued that human mathematical understanding, the ability to see that something is true rather than merely compute that it follows a rule, requires something beyond classical computation. And the only physics that allows for that kind of non-algorithmic process is quantum mechanics. That argument alone was enough to make the book he published in 1989 controversial, but the implication that followed was what made it genuinely radical. If consciousness requires quantum computation, it needs a physical home inside the body. Penrose identified microtubules as the candidate and began a collaboration with Stuart Hameroff, who had been studying them from the biology side. Together, they developed orchestrated objective reduction, the theory that each moment of conscious experience corresponds to a specific quantum event inside the microtubules of neurons. Here is how they described it in terms you can picture. Imagine the microtubules as a kind of quantum computer running inside each neuron. They are processing information in superposition, meaning multiple states at once, until the quantum system reaches a threshold. At that threshold, the system collapses to a single state. That collapse, they proposed, is not random. It is guided by the geometry of space-time itself, at the Planck scale, the smallest scale physics describes. That last part is what made physicists put the paper down and rub their eyes. Penrose was proposing that consciousness is connected to the fundamental structure of space and time, but every moment of awareness is a tiny event in the fabric of the universe itself. The theory has serious critics. Many neuroscientists argue that quantum coherence cannot survive long enough in the warm, wet brain to do useful computation. Some physicists argue that the connection to space-time geometry is mathematically unsupported. These are legitimate scientific objections. But the theory has also not been falsified. Recent work on quantum vibrations in microtubules has found signatures that the theory predicted, though the interpretation remains contested. And Hameroff has pointed out that anesthetic gases, which reversibly shut down consciousness without disrupting most other brain functions, appear to act specifically on microtubule dynamics. That is a strange place for an anesthetic to act if microtubules are purely structural. The reason this matters for death is direct. If consciousness arises from quantum events in microtubules, then at death, when microtubules break down, the quantum states they were processing do not simply vanish. They decohere, meaning they lose their coordinated pattern and bleed into the surrounding environment. But the information they contained, by the rule described in the previous chapter, is conserved in the broader quantum state of the universe. Penrose himself has speculated, carefully and with appropriate uncertainty, that this information may be capable of existing in a distributed form in the universe's space-time structure. He has described it as proto-conscious elements, a tentative phrase for something physics does not yet have the vocabulary to name. And there is another candidate, one that physics understands far better, where information survives in strange and persistent ways. Stand in front of a fire and burn a book. The book is gone. The words are gone. You cannot read it anymore. Every practical purpose of that book has ended, and yet, according to the fundamental equations of physics, every bit of information in that book still exists in the universe, encoded in the exact positions, velocities, and states of every smoke molecule, every ash particle, every photon of light that the fire released. In principle, if you tracked every one of those particles perfectly, you could reconstruct the book from the chaos. In practice, this is impossible. The information has become so dispersed and entangled with the environment that no technology conceivable could retrieve it. But possible and impossible are not the same as exists and does not exist. The physics says the information is still there. This is what physicists mean when they say information is conserved. The pattern survives even when the medium is destroyed. Now the harder question. Your brain is a physical system. It encodes information in the pattern of its connections, its electrical states, its chemical gradients. When it dies, those patterns degrade. The medium breaks down. By the fire analogy, the information disperses into the environment in a form that is practically irretrievable. Practically, but not by physics, erased. Here is where two different scientific camps split. One camp, the majority, says this is irrelevant to any meaningful concept of you surviving death. Even if the information technically persists in some dispersed form, the specific structure that generated your experience, your thoughts, your memories, your sense of being you, is gone. Dispersed information in the environment is not a mind, it is noise. The conversation is over, even if the letters still exist somewhere. The second camp, smaller and more cautious, asks a follow-up question. How do we know what structure is required to generate experience? We do not fully understand what in the brain produces consciousness in the first place. We cannot rule out, from first principles, that experience requires a specific substrate, as opposed to a specific pattern, regardless of what medium that pattern occupies. This sounds abstract. It becomes concrete when you think about what physicists call the holographic principle. Evidence from theoretical physics, particularly from studying black holes, suggests that the information describing a three-dimensional volume of space can be fully encoded on the two-dimensional surface surrounding it. The three-dimensional content is, in a precise mathematical sense, a projection of the surface information. The medium and the content are separable. If that principle extends to physical systems generally, and there is genuine debate about whether it does, then the idea that a mind requires its specific biological medium becomes harder to defend. The pattern and the medium may be more separable than intuition suggests. This is not a proven argument for survival. It is an open question with real physics behind it, and it has a companion mystery that makes it even harder to dismiss. Because there is a category of people who should have had no experience at all during a documented period of zero brain activity, and what they reported afterward turned out to be verifiable in a way that nobody was fully prepared for. In the early 1980s, a cardiologist named Michael Sabom began doing something other doctors were not doing. He sat down with cardiac arrest survivors and asked them, in careful clinical detail, to describe what they experienced while they were unconscious. Then he compared what they said to the medical records of exactly what had happened in the room during that time. He expected vague, dreamy reports that would not match reality. What he found was different. A subset of patients described accurate, specific details of their own resuscitation, the sequence of actions the medical team performed, the exact position of staff in the room, details of equipment they had never seen before. One patient described the defibrillator being used, including a specific detail about how it operates, that he accurately described despite having no medical background and no prior exposure to resuscitation procedures. Sabom's documentation was careful, and his methodology was conservative. He was a skeptic looking for confabulation, and found something harder to dismiss. The phenomenon has since been called veridical perception during near-death experience. Veridical means true. The perceptions match external, verifiable facts. This is the feature that separates these accounts from ordinary hallucinations, which do not produce accurate information about the real world. The most rigorous prospective study of this phenomenon was conducted by cardiologist Pim van Lommel across multiple Dutch hospitals. He enrolled patients before they had cardiac arrests, set up the conditions for careful observation, and tracked both the medical events and the subsequent reports. He found that roughly 18% of survivors reported some form of near-death experience. Among those, a smaller number reported perceptions of events during the period of cardiac arrest. Van Lommel then did something important. He checked whether reports included specific verifiable details. He compared them against the medical records and the recollections of the medical staff. Some reports matched in ways that the researchers found difficult to explain through sensory information available before unconsciousness, or through inference. The most discussed case from that study is a patient who accurately reported the location of his dentures during resuscitation. He had been deeply unconscious, cardiac function absent, when the dentures were removed and placed in a specific drawer. He later identified the nurse who removed them and described exactly where she put them. The nurse confirmed every detail. One case does not prove anything universally. Scientists are right to demand replication and controls, but veridical perception across multiple independent research groups continues to produce cases that resist easy dismissal. Here is the specific problem it creates for neuroscience. Accurate perception of the external world requires a functioning perceptual system. The brain, during documented cardiac arrest with confirmed absence of organized electrical activity, should have no capacity for accurate perception. The hardware is offline. The accounts suggest the software is still running. Where is it running? That question connects directly to something foundational about consciousness that neuroscience has struggled with quietly for decades. Something that most scientists acknowledge privately, but rarely raise in public, because it has no clean answer. And the moment you truly understand it, the question of what happens at death opens into something far larger than biology. Here is the most important question in all of science that most people have never heard of. Why does physical processing produce experience at all? Your brain takes in sensory information, processes it through neural networks, generates outputs like thoughts, decisions, and actions. All of that can, in principle, be described as information processing. Neurons fire, signals propagate, patterns form. If you could map every electrical event in a brain watching a sunset, you would have a complete physical description of the event. But you would not have captured the sunset, the actual experience, the specific quality of golden light, the feeling of warmth, the emotional texture of the moment exists nowhere in that physical description. You can describe every photon hitting every retinal cell. You can trace every signal up the optic nerve, through the visual cortex, through the associative regions. And at the end of all that description, the why of experience is still missing. Why does any of that processing feel like anything at all? This is what philosopher David Chalmers named the hard problem of consciousness in 1995. He distinguished it from what he called the easy problems, not easy in terms of difficulty, but tractable in principle. The easy problems are things like explaining how the brain integrates information, how it controls attention, how it produces reports about internal states. These are hard science problems, but they are the kind of problems where solving the mechanism solves the phenomenon. Figure out how the gears work, you understand the clock. The hard problem is different. You can solve every easy problem completely, and the hard problem remains. Even if you explained every neural mechanism perfectly, you would still face the question of why any of it is experienced rather than simply processed in the dark. Chalmers proposed that experience might be a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge, something that cannot be derived from other things but has to be taken as a basic given. Some physicists and philosophers have called this position panpsychism, the idea that experience or something like it is a basic property of the physical world. This is where the death question returns with new weight. If consciousness is a fundamental property of reality rather than something the brain generates, then the brain does not produce experience. The brain shapes and focuses it, organizes it, gives it specific content. But the raw capacity for experience may not originate in neurons. And if the brain is the lens rather than the light source, then breaking the lens does not extinguish the light. That is a philosophical argument, not a proven scientific fact. But here is what makes it more than philosophy. Several measurable phenomena, including terminal lucidity, veridical perception during flatline, and the global consistency of near-death experiences, fit more naturally into a framework where the brain is a receiver of consciousness than into a framework where it is the sole generator. A framework where breaking the radio does not end the broadcast. But even if that framework is correct, what exactly is being broadcast? What would consciousness be made of if it exists independently of the brain? There is a candidate, and it comes from an unexpected direction, from a biologist studying how the brain emits light. Biological tissue emits light, extremely faint light, far below what the eye can detect, but real, measurable, and structured. This is a confirmed phenomenon called biophoton emission. Living cells, including neurons, produce photons as a byproduct of metabolic processes. The interesting part is that the emission is far more organized than random biochemical noise would predict. The photons come out in patterns, coherent patterns, and the brain produces more of them than most other tissue. Researchers measuring biophoton emission from neural tissue have found that it correlates with neural activity. When neurons fire more, they emit more photons. The photons travel along nerve fibers. They appear to be able to move between neurons via the same pathways that electrical signals use. Some researchers have proposed that biophotons may serve as a secondary signaling system inside the brain. operating in parallel with electrical signaling. This is not mainstream neuroscience yet. Most neuroscientists treat it as an interesting side effect without clear functional significance. But a physicist named John Joe McFadden built an entire theory of consciousness around a related idea. McFadden proposed that the brain generates a global electromagnetic field through the combined electrical activity of its neurons, and that this field is the physical seat of consciousness. He calls it the CEMI theory, for conscious electromagnetic information. In his model, neurons do not just send signals to each other. Their collective firing creates a unified field, and that field has properties that individual neurons do not have. It is holistic. It integrates information across the entire brain simultaneously, and the information it encodes, McFadden argues, is what you experience as your mind. The brain's electromagnetic field is real and measurable. Every electroencephalogram, what most people call an EEG scan, is measuring the surface of that field. What McFadden added was the proposal that the field is the mind, not just a byproduct of the mind. Here is why this matters for death. If consciousness is an electromagnetic field generated by neural activity, then it exists in space as a field, not solely inside neurons. Fields can propagate. They can interact with other fields. They can, under certain conditions, persist after their source is disrupted. An analogy: a radio station produces a field. If the transmitter breaks, the field it already sent into the world does not instantly vanish. It propagates outward at the speed of light, carrying its signal until it disperses below the threshold of detectability. McFadden himself has been careful not to claim his theory implies survival of death. He has been explicit that the field would disperse and its information would be lost to practical retrieval. But the theory raises the structural question. If consciousness is field-based rather than neuron-based, the rules governing its persistence at death are the rules of field physics, not the rules of cell death. And field physics has something interesting to say about what happens to information in a field when it disperses. The answer connects back to something quantum mechanics established decades ago, a phenomenon so strange that Einstein called it spooky, and that turned out to be real. In 1935, Albert Einstein and two colleagues published a paper intended to demonstrate that quantum mechanics was incomplete. They described a scenario they found deeply troubling. Two particles, once interacted, remain connected regardless of the distance between them. Measure one, and you instantly know something about the other, even if it is on the other side of the universe. Einstein found this idea absurd. He called it spooky action at a distance, and believed it proved quantum mechanics had gaps that a better theory would eventually fill. Decades of experiments confirmed it is real. Quantum entanglement, the phenomenon Einstein objected to, is now a cornerstone of physics and the foundation of emerging quantum computing and communication technologies. Here is what entanglement means in plain terms. Two particles that have interacted become part of a single quantum system. Their states are correlated in a way that has no classical equivalent. Measuring one instantly determines a property of the other. The correlation is real, persistent, and does not degrade with distance. The word instantly matters here. The correlation between entangled particles is non-local. It exists outside the normal framework of signals traveling through space and time. Now bring this back to the brain. Biological systems create entanglement. Photosynthesis appears to use it. Enzyme reactions may involve it. If quantum processes inside neurons create entangled states between particles, and if those particles interact with other particles in the environment, then entanglement connects the brain's quantum states to the outside world in ways that do not terminate cleanly when the brain stops functioning. The particles entangled with the brain's quantum processes are not inside the skull. They are in the environment, in air molecules, in photons the brain has emitted, in anything that has interacted with the brain at the quantum level. When the brain shuts down, those entanglements do not snap. They persist in the particles that were already entangled. This is a physically real situation. The brain's quantum state, whatever information it contains, leaves traces in the entanglement structure of the broader environment that cannot be erased by the death of the brain. Whether that constitutes anything like survival depends again on what consciousness actually is. If it is the pattern in the entanglement structure rather than the biological activity that generated it, then the physics says the pattern is still out there, dispersed, entangled with the universe itself. The problem is that entangled information dispersed across the environment is in practice completely inaccessible. The pattern is there, the signal is in the noise. Nothing we can build could retrieve it, except, possibly, for one kind of system. One that exists at the scale where entanglement operates, that processes information the way a quantum computer processes it, and that is, in principle, present everywhere the dispersed information went. And that possibility opens into something that physicists find genuinely difficult to talk about, because the theory that contains it has experimental support, and its implications for death are the most extreme idea we have encountered so far. At the heart of quantum mechanics sits an unsolved problem that has generated more philosophical argument than any other question in physics. What causes a quantum system to collapse? Before you observe a quantum particle, it exists in superposition, meaning its properties are not defined. It is, in a rigorous mathematical sense, in multiple states at once. The moment you measure it, the superposition collapses. The particle takes a definite value. One outcome from all the possible ones is selected. The question physics cannot fully answer is what counts as a measurement. What interaction causes collapse? The equations describe the collapse but do not specify what triggers it. And the honest answer, the one that has been debated since the 1920s, is that nobody knows. Several interpretations have been proposed. The Copenhagen interpretation, the most widely taught, simply says collapse happens upon measurement and declines to ask what a measurement is at a deeper level. It works mathematically, and physicists use it constantly, but it leaves the underlying mechanism unspecified. The many worlds interpretation says collapse never happens. Instead, every possible outcome occurs in a branching universe. The apparent collapse is just our experience of one branch. This interpretation is mathematically elegant and disturbing to think about. A third interpretation, the one most relevant here, proposes that consciousness plays a direct role in collapse, that a quantum system exists in superposition until a conscious observer interacts with it, at which point the act of observation, the presence of awareness, is what precipitates collapse. This interpretation, taken seriously by some physicists, including John von Neumann, in his original mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics, implies that consciousness is not a product of physical processes. Consciousness is what physical processes happen in relation to. It is a prerequisite for the universe to have definite states at all. If this is correct, the universe requires observers. Conscious minds are not an incidental product of physics. They are part of the mechanism by which physics produces definite reality. And here is the edge of the cliff. If consciousness is required for the universe to collapse quantum possibilities into definite outcomes, then the universe has a stake in consciousness existing. A universe with no observers is a universe in permanent superposition. A universe with no definite reality. Does that mean the universe preserves consciousness? Does it mean that the ending of a conscious mind creates a localized reversion to superposition in some sense? Does it mean anything at all in practical terms? These are questions at the frontier of physics and philosophy. No consensus exists. Most physicists who study quantum foundations are deeply cautious about interpreting the observer role in terms of human consciousness specifically. They prefer to define observer as any physical interaction that records information, which does not require awareness. But the debate has never been fully settled. And one physicist, working not from quantum mechanics but from biology, built a theory that made the observer requirement central to the structure of reality itself. And his argument about death is the most direct scientific challenge to the ordinary view that we have encountered yet. In the final minutes of life, the brain does something no one anticipated. It releases a compound that, in ordinary life, the body produces only in tiny amounts and under heavily regulated conditions. The surge at death is massive by comparison to anything recorded in living subjects. The compound is dimethyltryptamine, a powerful psychedelic molecule that the brain synthesizes naturally. The existence of this surge is confirmed. Researchers at the University of Michigan published findings in 2022 demonstrating that cardiac arrest in rats triggers a dramatic spike in dimethyltryptamine production in the brain, specifically in the visual cortex and other regions associated with conscious experience. The levels detected far exceeded anything seen in normal brain states. Here is why this matters. Dimethyltryptamine, when administered to human subjects in controlled research settings, produces one of the most consistent and extraordinary subjective experiences of any compound known. Participants report leaving their bodies, encountering beings or presences, experiencing a review of their lives, feeling that they have access to reality more fundamental than ordinary waking life, returning with a profound sense that something important was shown to them. These reports, collected by researchers including Rick Strassman in his clinical trials at the University of New Mexico in the 1990s, overlap significantly with the core features of near-death experiences. The brain, in its final minutes, appears to flood itself with the exact compound that reliably produces near-death type experiences in living subjects. This discovery does two things simultaneously. It provides a partial biological mechanism for the phenomenology of dying, a reason why the experience takes the form it does, and it deepens the mystery rather than solving it, because the question of why the dying brain does this, and what adaptive purpose a massive perceptual experience at the moment of death could possibly serve, has no agreed answer. One hypothesis is that the dimethyltryptamine surge is simply a stress response, a byproduct of the metabolic chaos of dying cells. Under this view, the experience is an accident, a vivid final hallucination generated by a brain in biochemical crisis. A second hypothesis, more speculative, is that the surge is functionally significant, that the brain, in a process shaped by evolution over an enormous span of time, deliberately shifts consciousness into an altered state at death, for reasons we do not yet understand. Just as the life review and the gamma surge appear structured rather than random, the dimethyltryptamine release follows a specific pattern in specific brain regions. Accidents tend to be messier, and there is a third possibility, the one that cannot be tested with current tools, that the compound does not create the experience from nothing, but opens a perceptual window, that it shifts the brain's sensitivity in a way that allows it to detect something that is always there but ordinarily filtered out. That possibility sits at the edge of what science can currently address. But the question of what the dying brain might be detecting leads directly into something that a biologist named Robert Lanza spent years developing into a formal theory. And his argument about the relationship between consciousness and the universe changes the stakes of everything we have covered so far. Robert Lanza was a biologist, not a physicist. He made his reputation in stem cell research and regenerative medicine. He was not the kind of person expected to publish a theory about the fundamental nature of reality. In 2010, he did exactly that. He called the theory biocentrism. The core claim is this: life and consciousness are not products of the universe. The universe is a product of life and consciousness. This sounds like philosophy. Lanza built it from physics. He started with the measurement problem we explored earlier. Quantum particles exist in superposition until observed. The act of observation determines which definite reality emerges. Lanza took this seriously and followed it to its logical conclusion. If reality requires observation to be definite, and if observation requires a conscious observer, then consciousness is prior to physical reality. The universe is not a container that happened to produce minds. Minds are what generate the universe's definite structure. He extended this to cosmology. Physics has identified a remarkable feature of the universe called fine-tuning. The fundamental constants, things like the strength of gravity, the mass of the electron, the rate of cosmic expansion, are calibrated with extraordinary precision. Change any one of them by a small fraction, and the universe becomes one, where atoms cannot form, stars cannot burn, and life cannot exist. The probability of these constants taking their exact values by chance is by any calculation staggeringly small. The standard physics response to this is the multiverse. If an enormous number of universes exist with different constants, we happen to find ourselves in one that permits our existence simply because we could only exist here. The multiverse spreads the probability across a vast number of trials. Lanza offered a different answer. The constants are exactly right for consciousness, because consciousness is what makes them real. Observers do not discover a pre-existing universe. They participate in collapsing it from quantum possibility into definite form. A universe with different constants produces no observers, and therefore remains indefinite, unrealized. The universes that become real are the ones that consciousness can inhabit and observe. The implications for death are direct and extraordinary. If the universe is real because observers make it real, then the death of an observer is a more fundamental event than biology suggests. Lanza argues that within biocentrism, time and space are tools the conscious mind uses to process experience. They are not external containers. They are generated by the act of perception. Under this framework, death does not place you outside the universe. Consciousness is not inside the universe, vulnerable to its physical processes. Consciousness is what the universe is made from. You cannot step outside something you are constitutive of. Lanza has described this in terms of quantum theory directly. The you that exists is a pattern of information that the universe has produced as part of its own self-observation. When the biological system that currently hosts that pattern dies, the quantum information disperses. And within the mathematical structure of the theory, that information does not vanish. It reappears elsewhere, in other configurations of the universe observing itself. This is not a proven theory. Biocentrism has critics who argue it conflates the observer role in quantum mechanics with subjective human consciousness in a way that is not justified by the physics. These are legitimate criticisms, and the debate is ongoing. But here is the position it leaves us in. We have covered 17 separate lines of evidence and argument, from cellular survival to quantum entanglement, to neurochemistry to the structure of space and time. Each one individually has gaps. Together, they outline the shape of something that science cannot yet fully see. And the strangest piece of all is still ahead. Because some of the most important data in this entire conversation came from people who were not dying at all. Time stops making sense when you are dying. This is one of the most consistent and least discussed features of near-death accounts. Survivors do not describe the experience as long or short. They describe it as outside duration entirely. Moments stretch to contain what feels like years. Entire lifetimes review themselves in what the clock says was under a minute. The ordinary rhythm of before and after dissolves. Most people treat this as a quirk of perception under stress, something like how a car accident feels slow motion in the moment. The brain under pressure, we assume, distorts time the way fear always does. But the distortion in near-death accounts goes far beyond that, and it points towards something in physics that most people never encounter, something that changes what the word now actually means. Here is the physics first. Einstein's theory of relativity established that time is not a fixed backdrop against which events happen. Time is a dimension, and like the spatial dimensions, it is affected by mass, acceleration, and the velocity of the observer. Time runs slower near massive objects. Time runs slower for things moving fast. Two clocks that start synchronized will show different times after one of them travels and returns. This is confirmed, measured, and used practically every day in GPS satellite systems, which have to correct for the time difference between the satellites and the ground, or they would give wrong positions within minutes. But relativity also revealed something stranger. It says that the ordering of events in time, which happened first and which happened second, can differ depending on the observer's frame of reference. Events that are simultaneous for one observer are sequential for another. There is no universal now shared by all observers. Each conscious frame of reference has its own present moment. In the equations of physics, time looks different from how we experience it. The equations treat past, present, and future as equally real. They do not have a built-in arrow pointing from one to the next. The flow of time, the feeling that the present is special and the past is fixed while the future is open, is something experience generates. Physics does not require it. Some physicists, including Julian Barbour, have proposed that time does not flow at all, that all moments exist simultaneously in a four-dimensional structure, and what we experience as the passage of time is consciousness moving through a static landscape. This view is called the block universe, and it has serious support in theoretical physics. If the block universe is correct, then every moment of your life already exists simultaneously in the structure of space-time. Your birth, your death, every Tuesday between them, fixed, real, co-present in the geometry of the universe. Death, under this framework, does not erase past moments. They are already permanent. They always were. The configuration of the universe that contained your conscious experience at age 7 exists as surely as the one that contains your last breath. The arrow of time is something experience imposes on a structure that contains everything at once, and the dying brain, losing its ability to enforce sequential processing, may be briefly perceiving what physics says has always been true. All of it, present simultaneously, not as a hallucination, as a glimpse of the actual geometry of time. This idea cannot be tested directly, but the consistency between what dying people report and what physics describes about the true nature of time is not nothing. It is the kind of convergence that, in science, usually means something is worth looking at more carefully. And there is a phenomenon, confirmed and documented across dozens of cases, where that looking happened from outside the dying person entirely. In 1988, a hospice physician named Raymond Moody began collecting accounts he had not expected to find. He had spent years studying near-death experiences in people who almost died. Now, he was hearing something different. Reports from people who had been present at the deathbed of someone else. Family members, nurses, doctors, caregivers, who described entering or witnessing a shared experience at the moment the patient died. They had not been near death themselves. They had no physiological trigger, no cardiac arrest, no trauma, and yet they reported seeing what the dying person appeared to be seeing. Light, presences, a sense of passage. In some cases, they described their own consciousness seeming to briefly leave their body and enter the experience of the person dying. Moody called these shared death experiences. He gathered over 1,000 accounts over 2 decades. Other researchers have since documented the phenomenon independently. The features reported by bystanders match the features of near-death experiences with significant consistency. The light described is the same kind, warm, non-threatening, intensely present. The presence of deceased relatives appears in accounts from bystanders who did not know the dying person and had no information about who their loved ones were. In some documented cases, multiple people present at a deathbed simultaneously reported the same experience without communicating during it, and then described the same details afterward. The specific version that challenges ordinary explanation most directly is the multi-witness case. A family gathered at a bedside. The patient loses consciousness and begins the final phase of dying. Several people in the room, independently, report seeing a shape or light leave the body. In a handful of documented cases, people in different parts of the room reported the same visual content from their different positions. They were not sharing a hallucination through suggestion. They were at different angles and described what the experience looked like from where each of them stood. These cases are rare. They are hard to study rigorously because they happen spontaneously. They have not been captured under controlled laboratory conditions. Researchers are right to maintain appropriate skepticism, but the pattern has appeared across decades of collection, across different research groups, across cultural contexts where the expectation of such an experience differs. A grief hallucination, triggered by the emotional intensity of watching someone die, would be expected to vary widely between individuals and cultures. These reports converge. What mechanism would produce a shared perceptual event in physically healthy bystanders at the moment of another person's death? The electromagnetic field theory raises a possibility. If consciousness generates a field, and if that field becomes unusually powerful or structured in the final surge before death, a sufficiently strong field might interact with the perceptual systems of people physically nearby. This is speculative, and McFadden himself has not proposed it in these terms. But the physics of field interactions allows for influence at close range. The quantum entanglement framework raises a different possibility. People who have spent years in close relationship with someone build connections at every level of physical interaction, including the quantum. Entanglement between closely associated individuals is, in principle, real, though its significance for macroscopic experience is unknown. Or the shared experience reflects something about the nature of consciousness that neither framework currently captures. Something that has been proposed under a different name, one that shows up independently in philosophy, in physics, and in the oldest spiritual traditions on Earth. And the physics version of that idea has experimental support that surprised the researchers who found it. In the 1990s, a physicist and biologist named Rupert Sheldrake proposed an idea that the scientific mainstream rejected immediately and has argued about ever since. He called it morphic resonance. The proposal was that biological forms are shaped not only by genetics, but by a field that carries the accumulated patterns of similar organisms across time. Each species, in his model, inhabits a shared field that contains the memory of the species' previous behaviors and forms, and new individuals draw on that field automatically. Mainstream biology rejected this because it proposed information transfer through a mechanism that does not exist in established physics, and because the predictions it made were difficult to test cleanly. The rejection was and remains scientifically justified. But the idea of consciousness fields with properties beyond what individual brains generate did not originate with Sheldrake, and it has appeared in forms that mainstream physics takes more seriously. Quantum field theory, the most precisely tested framework in all of science, describes reality as fundamentally made of fields. Particles are not tiny solid objects. They are excitations of underlying fields that permeate all of space. The electron you think of as a particle is a ripple in the electron field, which exists everywhere simultaneously. Every particle of every type has a corresponding field that fills the universe. These fields are real. They interact, they carry information, and crucially, they do not switch off when a local excitation ends. When an electron and its antimatter partner annihilate each other, the electron field does not disappear. The excitation is gone. The field persists. Now, no established physics proposes a consciousness field in this sense. The leap from quantum fields to a field that carries subjective experience is enormous and unsupported by current evidence. Any honest account has to say that clearly. What makes the idea harder to dismiss than it first appears is that physicists already accept fields as the fundamental layer of reality. Particles are derivative, fields are primary, and the history of physics is a history of discovering that things we thought were fundamental were expressions of something deeper. If consciousness is not generated by neurons, but is itself a field phenomenon, then the neuron's role is to couple to that field, to resonate with it, to give it local specific content. And when the neuron dies, the local coupling ends. The field does not. This is not proven. It may never be testable in its current form, but here is what grounds it in something measurable. Global measurements of human electromagnetic field activity, taken during large-scale events where billions of people share a focused emotional state, have shown anomalous correlations in random event generators placed around the planet. This is the Global Consciousness Project, run out of Princeton University. The methodology is contested. The effect size is small. The interpretation is wide open. But the data shows something. Moments of shared human attention correlate with measurable deviations in what should be pure randomness. Whatever that effect is, it suggests that consciousness, expressed at scale, leaves a detectable trace in the physical world, beyond individual bodies. And the body itself, at death, generates something measurable that no one fully understands yet. In 1907, a physician named Duncan McDougall conducted an experiment that became famous in the wrong way. He weighed 6 dying patients on a precise scale immediately before and after death. He reported a consistent weight loss at the moment of death, approximately 3/4 of an ounce, and proposed he had measured the weight of the soul. The experiment was deeply flawed. The sample size was tiny. The results were inconsistent across the 6 subjects, with only one showing the reported drop clearly. The methodology allowed for confounding factors like moisture loss and muscle relaxation. Subsequent attempts to replicate it failed. Scientists rightly dismissed it. But the question it gestured at has never fully gone away, and more rigorous versions of it have produced findings that are harder to wave off. The body emits, continuously, measurably, in multiple forms. Biophotons, the faint light produced by metabolic processes, stream outward from living tissue at all times. The brain's electromagnetic field extends beyond the skull, beyond the skin, into the surrounding space. Body heat radiates as infrared. The lungs exhale molecular compounds that carry chemical information about internal states. At death, each of these emissions changes in characteristic ways. Some cease abruptly. Others remarkably surge briefly before falling. The biophoton emission from some tissue increases immediately after cardiac arrest before declining, matching the pattern seen in electrical brain activity. What makes this scientifically interesting is that the body's information output at death is not simply a cessation. It is a structured event with phases. Something organized is happening in the emissions pattern of a dying body. A team of researchers studying biophoton emission in neural tissue found that dying neurons produce a burst of photons in their final moments that is coherent, meaning the photons are synchronized in a way that random thermal processes do not produce. Coherent light is laser light. Neurons in the moment of death briefly emit something with laser-like properties. The researchers were careful about interpretation. They were measuring a physical phenomenon and making no claims about consciousness. But coherent photon emission from dying neurons, traveling along nerve fibers and into the surrounding space, is a form of structured information leaving the body at the moment of death. Where does it go? Into the room, into the bodies of people nearby, into surfaces that reflect or absorb it, into the broader electromagnetic environment. The information carried in that light is not large by any measure. The total biophoton output of a dying brain is minuscule compared to the information density of the brain itself. Whatever is encoded in those photons is a tiny fraction of the whole, but it is structured, it is coherent, and it exits the body at the moment of death, traveling outward at the speed of light into an environment where it will interact with other systems indefinitely. Something leaves, something physical, measurable, structured. Whether it carries anything that matters for the question of survival depends entirely on what consciousness is made of. And to understand that, we need to go to the most fundamental question neuroscience has never answered, one so basic that most scientists prefer to leave it unspoken. Open a human brain and look at it. You will find tissue. You will find neurons and glial cells and blood vessels and myelin sheaths. You will find electrochemical gradients and synaptic vesicles. You will find, if you look at the right scale, the molecular machinery of memory formation and signal transmission. You will not find the person. This is the binding problem, and it has no solution. Your experience right now is unified. You hear words, see a screen, feel the chair or cushion beneath you, have a vague sense of your body in space, carry a background emotional tone, and hold a thread of meaning connecting this moment to the previous one. All of these arrive as a single, seamless experience. One observer, one moment, one you. Your brain processes all of these things in physically separate regions. The auditory cortex handles sound. The visual cortex handles the feeling of the chair. The prefrontal cortex manages meaning and continuity. These areas are not adjacent. They are separated by significant distances in brain tissue, connected by neural pathways along which signals travel with measurable delay. How do they combine into a single unified experience? No one knows. Various proposals have been advanced. Temporal synchrony is the most popular. The idea that neurons across these regions fire in coordinated rhythms, particularly gamma waves, and that this synchronized firing binds the information into a unified moment. This is a good hypothesis with experimental support. It explains how coordination happens. It does not explain why synchronized neurons produce a unified feeling rather than just synchronized neurons. The binding problem is the hard problem in a specific form. Even if you explain the synchronization completely, the question remains, why does synchronized activity across separate regions feel like one thing to one observer? Where is the observer located? In which neuron? In which region? The answer, honestly, is that the observer appears to be nowhere specific and everywhere simultaneously. This is deeply strange. Every other property of a physical system can be localized. Heat is in the molecules, electrical charge is in the electrons, momentum is in the moving mass. Consciousness appears to be distributed across the whole brain without being fully present in any part of it. One interpretation is that consciousness is an emergent property, something that arises from complexity, the way wetness arises from water molecules. No single molecule is wet, but enough of them together produce wetness. No single neuron is conscious, but enough of them together produce awareness. Emergence is a real phenomenon. But it is also a word that sometimes functions as a placeholder, a way of saying this happens without explaining how. The jump from neural synchrony to unified subjective experience is larger than any other emergence we know of. Every other emergent property in physics can, in principle, be derived from the properties of its components. No one has derived experience from the properties of neurons. The alternative is that consciousness is fundamental, not emergent, that the unity of experience reflects a unity in reality itself, that the brain is tapping into, not generating. If that is correct, the binding problem dissolves. The unified observer exists because consciousness is unified at the level of reality. The brain does not create the unity, it inherits it. And that alternative, philosophical as it sounds, has a version that is fully mathematical, a version built by a physicist who spent years trying to explain exactly what experience is made of. His framework is the most ambitious attempt in modern science to answer the hard problem, and it says something about death that no other theory does. In 2014, a physicist named Max Tegmark proposed something that put him outside the mainstream of his field. He proposed that consciousness is a state of matter, not a metaphor, a literal proposal. Just as matter can exist in states like solid, liquid, and gas, depending on how its particles are arranged and how they interact, Tegmark proposed that consciousness is what matter does when it is arranged in certain ways and processes information, in certain patterns. He called this state perceptronium. The proposal was motivated by a specific observation. Physical systems that are conscious appear to share measurable properties. They are highly integrated, meaning information across the system influences the whole. They are highly differentiated, meaning the system can exist in an enormous number of distinct states. These two properties together, high integration and high differentiation, produce what Tegmark identified as the signature of a conscious system. This matches experimental findings. Brain states during conscious waking life show dramatically higher integration and differentiation than brain states during deep sleep or under anesthesia when consciousness is absent. The measure is not arbitrary. It correlates with the presence or absence of experience as reported by subjects. A neuroscientist and psychiatrist named Giulio Tononi had earlier formalized this into a mathematical framework called integrated information theory. He defined a precise measure called phi of how much integrated information a system contains. Higher phi means more consciousness, lower phi means less. 0 phi means none. The theory makes a striking prediction. Any system with non-zero integrated information has some degree of experience. A thermostat, with its minimal integration, has a vanishingly tiny amount. A human brain has an enormous amount. The theory does not require biological neurons specifically. It requires the right kind of information integration. Here is the implication for death that neither Tegmark nor Tononi have fully developed, but that follows from their frameworks. If consciousness is defined by integrated information rather than biological substrate, then the question at death is whether the integrated information pattern persists in any form after the biological system fails. The brain's specific implementation dissolves. The pattern, if it transfers to another substrate, carries the consciousness with it. This is the logic behind mind-uploading proposals. Copy the integrated information pattern of a brain into a different medium, and the consciousness continues. The theory says the medium is irrelevant. The pattern is what matters. Now, mind uploading as an engineering project faces extraordinary practical challenges that may be insurmountable. But as a theoretical statement, integrated information theory says that your consciousness is your information pattern, not your neurons. And information patterns, as physics established, are conserved. If the pattern disperses at death rather than transfers cleanly, the resulting consciousness would be fragmented, distributed, incoherent, possibly imperceptible as experience in any meaningful sense. But the framework says something continues, even if what continues bears little resemblance to what you experience now. There is one more piece, and it may be the strangest of all. A peer-reviewed study published in 2023 recorded something in the brains of dying patients that matched integrated information theory's predictions in a way no one had specifically looked for before. And what it showed was that the moment of death produced the highest measurable phi the dying patients had ever registered. The 2023 study that monitored dying patients with continuous brain electroencephalogram recording found something unexpected in the data. In 2 of the 4 patients whose brains showed a gamma surge after cardiac arrest, the integrated information measure peaked. The coordination between brain regions, the synchronized activity across the whole system, reached its highest recorded level in the minutes surrounding death, higher than during any prior recording, higher than during normal waking life. The researchers were careful and specific. They were describing an electrical event. They were not claiming the patients were having rich experiences, though they noted the result was consistent with the possibility. They published it as a finding, not a conclusion. But here is what makes it extraordinary in the context of everything we have covered. If integrated information theory is correct, and if integrated information corresponds to consciousness, then the patient's level of consciousness reached its peak in the period immediately surrounding death. The dying brain, at the edge of silence, briefly became more conscious than it had ever been. This is the opposite of what the shutdown model predicts. If death is simply the failure of the systems that generate consciousness, you would expect consciousness to decline monotonically towards zero. Instead, the data shows a surge, a peak, a final intensification before the fall. What is the brain doing in that peak? Several possibilities have been proposed. One is that the collapse of inhibitory systems, the ones that normally regulate and suppress most of the brain's activity, briefly releases the full system into unrestricted coordination. The suppression that gives waking consciousness its focused, selective nature is gone, and what remains is a brief window of total integration. Another possibility is that the peak represents the brain's final computation, a processing event of unusual scope and completeness that the normal constraints of waking life never permit. A third possibility, the one that sits at the edge of what science currently allows, is that the peak is not produced by the dying brain, but detected by it. That as the biological filters that ordinarily limit perception begin to fail, something beyond ordinary neural processing briefly comes through. That third option connects directly to a concept from the history of consciousness research that went underground for decades and has recently begun to resurface in serious academic contexts. The filter theory, the idea that the brain does not generate consciousness, the brain narrows it. William James, the father of American psychology, suggested in the 1800s that the brain might function as a reducing valve, admitting only a thin stream of a much larger field of consciousness into ordinary awareness. Aldous Huxley developed the idea further. Huxley proposed that survival value, the need to focus on immediate threats and opportunities, drives the brain to suppress most experience in order to keep the organism functioning. Under this view, death is not the extinction of consciousness. It is the removal of the valve. The full stream, ordinarily filtered to a trickle for practical reasons, floods through. What that stream contains is what dying people have been trying to describe for thousands of years, and the researchers who have spent the most time listening to those descriptions have noticed something about them that points toward a final, genuinely unsettling convergence. William James, the same psychologist who proposed the filter theory, said something about evidence that every scientist studying consciousness at death should have carved into their wall. He said, "To disprove the law that all crows are black, you do not need to examine every crow. You need to find one white crow." He meant that a single well-documented, rigorously verified case of post-death awareness would overturn the entire assumption that consciousness ends at biological death. One case, confirmed, unexplained by any mechanism within the existing framework. The search for that white crow has been going on for over a century, and the honest assessment is this: we have not found it yet with the certainty that science requires. But we have found things that are very hard to explain as ordinary black crows. The veridical perceptions documented by Sabom, by Van Lommel, and by others represent the closest candidates. A patient accurately reporting a specific verifiable detail about what happened in the room during a period of confirmed absent brain function. The denture case, from Van Lommel's study. Cases from Sabom's research, where patients described their own resuscitation with details that matched the medical record and that they could not have obtained through ordinary means. Each case individually has alternative explanations that are possible. If strained, the patient may have briefly regained consciousness and perceived something before resuscitation. The patient may have heard something in the room during the event, The patient may have had prior knowledge that informed a confabulated account. Medical staff may have inadvertently communicated details. Memory for accounts given long after the fact may be unreliable. None of these alternatives is impossible. All of them become progressively less plausible when applied to the specific details of specific cases. But plausible and possible are different things. Science rightly maintains the standard. What has shifted the conversation is accumulation. No single case is the white crow, but hundreds of cases from multiple independent research teams across decades of study, across different cultural and medical contexts, share features that alternative explanations struggle to account for simultaneously. The alternative explanations work case by case. They become strained when applied to the pattern as a whole. A research program specifically designed to find the white crow was launched in 2008. Called the AWARE study, led by cardiologist Sam Parnia at the University of Southampton. It placed visual targets in hospital resuscitation rooms, images on shelves positioned so they could only be seen from above. The goal was to see if cardiac arrest patients reporting out-of-body perceptions could identify those targets. After years of data collection, only one patient reported an out-of-body experience during a resuscitation that took place in a room with a target. That patient did not describe the target specifically. The study was underpowered, partly because resuscitations are unpredictable, and patients rarely happen to be in a room with a target when they arrest. The methodology was sound. The result was inconclusive. Parnia extended the research under a new name, AWARE-2, with more sites and refined methods. That work continues. Here is what the search itself reveals. Science takes this seriously enough to design rigorous experiments around it. The question has moved from philosophy to protocol. Whatever we find next, we are looking with better tools than we have ever had. And there is one more piece of the puzzle that the tools of physics have illuminated. Something about the nature of the present moment itself that connects every thread in this conversation to a single, irreducible strangeness. Here is something physics has known for decades and rarely talks about outside academic philosophy. The present moment does not exist in the equations. Every equation describing the physical world treats time as a dimension. The mathematics works equally well in both directions, forward and backward. The laws of physics, at the fundamental level, are time-symmetric. They do not distinguish between past and future. They do not mark the present as special. And yet your entire experience of being alive is organized around the present. The past is fixed. The future is open. Right now is where you exist. This felt reality, this sense of a moving present, is the most immediate fact of consciousness. It is also completely absent from the mathematical description of the universe. Physicists call this the problem of the arrow of time. Why does time feel like it flows in one direction if the equations treat both directions equally? The standard answer involves entropy, the tendency of systems to move from ordered to disordered states. Entropy increases in one direction, so we experience that direction as forward. This is a real explanation, and it accounts for much of why time feels asymmetric. But it does not explain the present. Entropy describes a direction. It does not explain why there is a moving now at all. It does not explain why you are always at the leading edge of time, rather than distributed across all your moments equally. The block universe interpretation of physics, described in the chapter on time perception, says that all moments exist equally. Past, present, and future are all equally real, laid out in four-dimensional space-time. The present is not special in the geometry. It is only special to the observer moving through it, which means the present moment is a product of consciousness. The universe does not have a now. You do. Sit with that for a moment. If the present moment is something consciousness generates, then the question of what happens to consciousness at death is also the question of what happens to the present moment. Your now ends. Does the experience of being present end with it? Or does it rejoin some broader, observer-independent structure in which all moments coexist? Physics cannot answer this. The equations that describe time do not describe experience, but the fact that the most immediate feature of consciousness, its knownness, its sense of being present, has no correspondent in physical law, is not a minor gap. It is the place where the map runs out. And when the map runs out, science has a choice, Assume the territory continues in the direction the map was going, even though you can no longer chart it. Or acknowledge that the territory beyond the edge might be organized differently than anything the map has described so far. The strongest argument that the territory beyond the edge is different comes from something that consciousness itself does, which no physical process does, something that has been measured, studied, and found to be real. And understanding it requires going back to the smallest scale of reality and asking a question nobody has satisfactorily answered. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Every cell in your body has been replaced many times over. The neurons in your brain, among the longest-lived cells, still replace their molecular components continuously. The proteins that make up your synapses turn over completely every few weeks. The atoms in your body are borrowed from food, water, and air, and return to the environment constantly. The physical substance of you is a river, not a stone. And yet you feel continuous. You feel like you have always been you. The memories connect. The personality persists. The sense of being the same self that woke up yesterday and will wake up tomorrow is among the most stable features of conscious experience. Where does that continuity come from? Biologically, the answer is pattern preservation. The connections between neurons change slowly. The information encoded in the structure of those connections persists even as the molecules that implement it turn over. You are continuous because the pattern is continuous, even though the substrate constantly renews itself. This is a remarkable fact. Your continuity of self does not depend on the continuity of any specific physical material. It depends on the continuity of a pattern. The atoms that constituted you at age 5 are almost entirely gone. The pattern they implemented is still here. Now apply this to death. If identity is pattern rather than substrate, then the question of survival becomes, does the pattern persist? The biological substrate clearly fails. Every physical system that has been implementing the pattern stops functioning. But the pattern itself, the specific information configuration that made you you, by the conservation of quantum information, enters the universe in a distributed form. It is no longer coherent, no longer localized, no longer capable of the kind of integration that generates experience in the way a living brain generates it. But as a pattern, as information, it has not been erased. The analogy is music. A symphony exists as a pattern of sound waves. Play it once and it ends. But the pattern is not gone. It can be reconstructed from the score, performed again, transmitted in recordings, remembered in the ears of everyone who heard it. The specific performance ends. The pattern survives in forms that can generate new performances. If consciousness is a pattern rather than a performance, the ending of one biological performance does not end the pattern. The score persists in the information structure of the universe. Whether the score can ever be performed again, whether the pattern can ever recohere into something that experiences, is a question physics does not yet have the tools to address. But here is the deepest version of the question. If you are a pattern, and patterns are defined by their information rather than their substrate, then you have always been something the universe is doing rather than something the universe contains. You are an event in the ongoing computation of reality. Events end, but the information they generated and the changes they made to the systems they interacted with propagate forward indefinitely. The you that existed changed the universe in ways that will never be fully undone. Every interaction, every entanglement, every photon emitted, every person whose quantum state was altered by proximity to yours. The signature of your existence is written into the physical state of the universe at a level that survives your death. Whether any of that constitutes survival in a meaningful sense depends on what you think you are. And that question leads directly to the thing artificial intelligence research has accidentally clarified, something researchers in that field did not expect to illuminate about human consciousness. When researchers began seriously trying to build artificial minds, they assumed the hard part would be computation. Give a system enough processing power, they thought, and intelligence would follow. Enough data, enough parameters, enough optimization, and something mind-like would emerge. For narrow tasks, this turned out to be correct. Modern artificial intelligence systems exceed human performance at chess, at protein folding prediction, at image recognition, at language generation. But the researchers hit a wall that no amount of additional computation has moved. The systems have no experience. They process, they generate, they respond. They do not, as far as anyone can tell, feel anything. This is not a provable negative claim. You cannot prove another system has no inner experience, any more than you can prove another person does. But the structure of current artificial intelligence reveals something important about what experience seems to require. Current artificial intelligence systems, however sophisticated, are feed-forward processes. Information goes in, transformations happen, output comes out. Even systems with memory and context windows are fundamentally very complex input-output mappings. They lack the kind of global, simultaneous self-reference that the brain exhibits. They process sequentially, even when parallelized. They do not have a unified moment of experience, because their architecture has no mechanism for creating one. The brain is different in a specific way. Its processing is massively recurrent. Signals flow forward, backward, sideways. Every region influences every other region. The system is processing itself as much as it is processing external input. This self-referential loop, sometimes called reentrant processing, is a candidate for what generates unified experience. The brain is a system whose output feeds back into its input at every level simultaneously. No current artificial intelligence architecture has this property in a comparable degree. And despite decades of research, attempts to build systems with genuine self-reference of this kind have not produced anything that behaves as if it is conscious. What this tells us about the brain's natural process at death is indirect but important. If the self-referential loop is what generates experience, then at death, the loop dissolves. The connections that allow the brain to continuously reference itself break down in sequence. As neurons lose function, the loop shortens, it fragmented, and then it ends. But here is the strange implication. The last coherent state of the loop, the final configuration in which the self-referential system was still running as a whole, is the last moment of unified experience. What follows is not experienced as darkness. It is not experienced at all, because the experiencer requires the loop to exist. The dying person does not experience the end of consciousness. They experience up to the end, and then there is no position from which to experience the ending. This is not comfort necessarily, but it resolves one specific fear. The experience of dying may be vivid, may be extraordinary, may be exactly what the neurochemistry and electrical activity suggest. And the termination of experience is not something the experiencer encounters. There is no moment of going dark. There is only the last moment of light. What comes after that moment is the part where science truly runs out of its own methods. Here is the deepest paradox in all of consciousness research. Science requires an observer. Every measurement, every experiment, every data point requires a conscious mind to design the protocol, read the instrument, interpret the result. Science is done by conscious beings. It is the tool consciousness uses to study the world. Consciousness is trying to study itself, and the moment it turns the instrument on its own fundamental nature, it finds that the instrument is the thing being studied. You cannot step outside your own consciousness to observe it from an external perspective. The observation and the observed are the same thing. This is not a technical limitation that better equipment will solve. It is structural. Every scientist studying consciousness is using consciousness to do it, which means consciousness is always on both sides of the experiment simultaneously. This does not mean the science is worthless. It means there is a fundamental limit. The hardest questions about consciousness, those about why it exists, what it is made of, whether it survives, may be questions that consciousness cannot fully answer about itself. Think of it this way. A photograph cannot capture its own camera. You can photograph the camera in a mirror, but the image of the camera in the mirror is not the camera taking the picture. You can use consciousness to map some properties of consciousness, but the act of mapping uses the very thing you are mapping, and the mapper cannot stand outside itself to check whether the map is accurate. This limit matters specifically for death, because death is the one state of consciousness that no living scientist can currently study from the inside. Near-death experiences give us reports from the edge. People who returned from cardiac arrest give us data from a vantage point close to death. But the territory beyond the final threshold has no messengers. Or rather, it has only one kind of potential messenger, and science has no agreed framework for evaluating what they report. The philosophical tradition that takes this most seriously has proposed that the limit itself is information, that the fact science cannot fully explain consciousness from inside consciousness suggests that consciousness is something the universe has built into its own structure at a level prior to scientific description. Something foundational, not derived. If that is correct, then science's inability to explain what happens at death is not a gap that more research will eventually close. It is a structural feature of the boundary between consciousness and the physical systems it inhabits. Every framework we have examined in this conversation, quantum mechanics, field theory, information theory, biocentrism, integrated information, the observer role in measurement, converges on the same boundary. They approach it from different directions. None of them crosses it. But at the boundary, something extraordinary is visible. All of these independent frameworks, developed by researchers who mostly did not coordinate with each other, and who often disagree sharply, are pointing at the same blind spot. That convergence is itself data. And the final question, the one that all of these lines of research together lead toward, is something so fundamental that answering it would reshape not just our understanding of death, but our understanding of what it means for anything to exist at all. In the last decade, as monitoring technology became more precise and more researchers began taking the neuroscience of dying seriously, a pattern has emerged across independent laboratories that was not predicted by any theory. The dying brain is not simply quieting, it is doing something structured, something that if observed in a living brain would be interpreted as a moment of extraordinary cognitive significance. Here is the accumulation. The gamma wave surge, confirmed in both animals and humans after cardiac arrest, representing the highest coordinated brain activity patterns associated with conscious perception. The dimethyltryptamine release, confirmed in rats after cardiac arrest, in quantities far exceeding anything seen during normal brain states, flooding the regions most associated with visual experience and conscious feeling. The peak in integrated information, recorded in the 2023 study, where the measure of conscious integration reached its highest documented value in the moments surrounding death. The surge in biophoton emission from dying neural tissue, structured and coherent, propagating outward from the brain in the final minutes. And the correlated slowdown of clock time as reported by survivors, matching the physics of how time perception changes under extreme states of neural activation. Every one of these phenomena, measured independently by different research teams using different tools, points in the same direction. The dying brain passes through a state of unusual intensity, unusual integration, and unusual output before it goes quiet. This cannot be coincidence. The biological systems of dying are coordinated. Something in the process of shutdown produces conditions that, by every measure we have for conscious experience, resemble peak conscious experience, rather than its absence. The most conservative scientific interpretation is that these are stress artifacts, that a brain losing its regulatory control inevitably generates cascades that look like intense activity but mean nothing experientially. That the correlation with reported near-death experiences is because stressed brains generate hallucinations, and stressed brains at death generate more intense ones. This is a legitimate scientific position, held by many serious researchers. The competing interpretation is that the dying brain is genuinely doing something, that the evolutionary, biochemical, and electrical systems of the brain converge in the final moments on a process that is not random stress, but organized transition. That whatever function consciousness serves for the organism, the final discharge of that function happens at full intensity, not diminished. And if the dying brain's final state is genuinely its most integrated, most coordinated, most information-dense state, then the question of what happens to that information when the biological system finally stops is not a question about the end of something modest. It is a question about the fate of the most complex, most structured information event the brain ever produced. That question is one the physics of information conservation cannot avoid. And its answer, whatever it turns out to be, will have implications not just for what happens when we die, but for what we understand ourselves to be while we are alive. Across the 30 chapters before this one, a single idea has surfaced from every direction we looked. You are not your atoms. You are the pattern your atoms implement. This is not metaphysics. It follows directly from the biology. Your atoms replace themselves while you persist. The pattern is what continues. You have always been information organized by matter, not matter that happens to think. And the implications of this for death are profound in a very specific, non-mystical way. Information theory, the branch of mathematics developed by Claude Shannon in the 1940s, established that information has a precise, measurable quantity independent of its physical medium. A message contains the same information whether it is written in ink, transmitted as radio waves, or encoded in the magnetic domains of a hard drive. The medium changes, the information is invariant. Shannon's framework describes classical information. Quantum information theory, which extends this to quantum systems, adds a crucial property. Quantum information is not just medium independent, it is conserved. The total quantum information in a closed system never changes. It transforms, it disperses, it entangles with other systems. It never disappears. If your consciousness is a pattern of information, and if that pattern is encoded at least partially at the quantum level, as the Penrose-Hameroff framework suggests, and as quantum effects in biology make increasingly plausible, then at death, you transform, you disperse, you entangle with the environment. You do not disappear. The pattern that was you becomes part of the quantum state of everything you interacted with. The people near you, carrying quantum states entangled with yours. The air in the room, carrying the photons your brain emitted. The electromagnetic field of the earth, carrying the field your brain contributed to. The universe, carrying the entanglement record of every interaction you ever had. This is not a comfortable or familiar kind of survival. It is nothing like the continued personal experience most people hope for. The unified self, the you, that wakes up each morning and remembers yesterday, requires a coherent, integrated biological system to exist in that form. Dispersed information in the environment is not that. But it is not nothing. And here is the part that most presentations of this idea skip. The information that disperses at your death is not inert. Entangled information is correlated information. It influences the quantum states of everything it has entangled with. Those influences propagate forward in time, influencing future states in ways that, at the quantum level, carry the signature of what you were. You would not experience this. There is no localized consciousness to have the experience. But the universe, in every system that carries your quantum signature, continues to compute with the information that was you. Whether that counts as survival is a question of definition, not physics. Define survival as the continuation of subjective experience. And no, the dispersed pattern does not survive in any meaningful personal sense. Define survival as the conservation of the information pattern that constituted you. And yes, something of you persists in the state of the universe indefinitely. The universe does not forget you. By law, it cannot. What this means practically, what it might feel like from the inside if it feels like anything, whether the dispersed pattern can ever reconstitute into something that experiences. These are the open questions at the edge of the conversation, and they all depend on an answer to the deepest question of all, one that physics has circled for a century without finding the center. Science has a method: observe, hypothesize, test, refine. The method is extraordinary. It has produced vaccines and telescopes and quantum computers and a map of the genome. It has extended human life, explained the origin of the cosmos, and described the behavior of matter at scales from subatomic particles to galaxy clusters. And it has one structural blind spot. It cannot study the observer. Every observation requires an observer. Every measurement requires a mind that reads the result. Science describes the physical world with precision and power. It cannot, from within its own method, describe the thing that does the describing. The map cannot include the cartographer. This is why the question of what happens at death resists the scientific method at its most fundamental level. Death is the event that happens to the observer, and the method requires the observer to be present and functioning, to count as science. What we are left with after 31 chapters of the best evidence and the most rigorous theories available, is the precise shape of the gap. We know the brain produces its most intense, most integrated activity in the period surrounding death. We know quantum information is conserved. We know the pattern of the self persists, dispersed in the quantum state of the universe. We know the binding problem has no solution. We know the present moment has no physical correspondent. We know consciousness and observer are inseparable from the method we use to study anything. We know that every framework that approaches the question of consciousness honestly arrives at the same place, a boundary. Beyond it, the tools we have stop working. And on the other side of that boundary, the most consistent data we have, from millions of people across thousands of years of human history, across every culture, across every religious tradition and its absence, describes something that the dying brain produces in its final moments. Something vivid, something that feels more real than ordinary life, something that carries, in the accounts of those who return from its edge, a consistent core message. That message is not comfortable or convenient. It does not fit any single religious tradition, and it does not fit strict materialism. It sits in between, in the territory that the physics and the neuroscience and the philosophy all point toward, without being able to fully occupy. The message is this: consciousness may be more fundamental than the body that carries it. The boundary of death may not be the boundary of experience. And the universe, at its deepest level, may be organized around awareness in a way that our current science is only beginning to see the outline of. Whether that is true, precisely how it is true, what it means for the specific, personal, continuous you that wakes up each morning, those questions remain open. But they are being studied, rigorously, by serious people with serious tools. And the data coming back is strange enough, consistent enough, and theoretically grounded enough that the question deserves to stay open. Which brings us to the only honest place this conversation can end. Stand at the edge of what science knows and look forward. On one side, everything established. The brain is the most complex structure we have found in the universe. Consciousness arises from it in ways we can measure and partially describe. Death destroys the biological system that implements conscious experience as we recognize it. These things are confirmed. On the other side, everything unresolved. The hard problem has no solution. The binding problem has no solution. Quantum information is conserved, and its implications for consciousness are genuinely unknown. The dying brain produces its most intense activity at the moment of shutdown. Veridical perceptions during documented flatlining have been recorded. Shared death experiences occur in bystanders. Terminal lucidity restores function in destroyed brains. All of this is confirmed and unexplained. The honest position is not certainty in either direction. The materialist who says consciousness obviously ends at death is making a claim that goes beyond the current evidence. The believer who says consciousness obviously survives is making a claim that also goes beyond it. Both positions require filling the gaps with confidence that the data does not support. What the data supports is a third position, one that is more demanding than either of the easy answers, and more interesting. Consciousness is the least understood phenomenon in all of science. The evidence suggests it is more fundamental, more strange, and more persistent than the dominant model of the last century assumed. The dying process is not a simple shutdown. It is an event with structure, with chemistry, with measurable electrical signatures that suggest something organized is happening at the very end. And the universe operates according to rules that conserve information, that connect distant systems through entanglement, that organize reality around observation in ways we do not yet fully understand. The frontier where physics and neuroscience and philosophy converge is not a dead end. Researchers are building better tools. The aware studies continue, with more precise methods and more sites. Quantum biology is maturing rapidly. Integrated information theory is generating testable predictions. Biophoton research is growing. The neuroscience of dying is becoming a legitimate field rather than a fringe one. The researchers working in this space are not credulous. They are rigorous. They follow the data and they maintain appropriate uncertainty. And what they keep finding is that the data is stranger than the standard model predicts. Here is what to hold on to from everything covered in this conversation. You are a pattern of information in a universe that conserves information. You generate a present moment in a universe where physics says all moments coexist. You create a unified experience from separate physical processes in a way that has no agreed explanation. You exist at the intersection of quantum physics and biological organization at a level we have barely begun to map. Death ends the biological performance. Whether it ends the pattern, the information, the field, the observer, the experience, none of those questions have been answered. Some of them may not be answerable with the tools we currently have. But the question itself, why anything is experienced rather than simply processed. What happens when the experiencer stops? Whether the universe requires its observers in some deep and permanent way. That question is the most important one, open in science. And you are, right now, a conscious mind considering its own nature. That act, the universe becoming aware of itself through you, is the fact that makes all of this matter. Whatever happens at the edge, you are here now. Fully, completely, extraordinarily here. And that, by every measure physics and neuroscience and philosophy can bring to bear, is something the universe went to remarkable lengths to produce. The research continues, the frontier is open, and somewhere in the data still being collected, the answer may already be waiting.